We just have a little bit more in this lecture on the microbes and plants section. And we were just at the point where we were talking about the vascular plants and that they're dominant producers in many wetlands, shallow lakes, and ponds, and based on the wide variety of forms. And I believe we had finished up with this question: why is it difficult for macrophytes to establish in large reservoirs? And there are several reasons for that. One is that reservoirs are used to move water, control water levels, so they go way up and down. So a lot of times, actually, in reservoirs, to control macrophytes, they'll, if they do get over abundant, they'll drop the water and let them freeze or dry in the winter, and then pop it back up again and kill them. In addition, if there's a lot of wave action, it's really difficult for them to get established. Something that's small like a phytoplankton, because the Reynolds number is small and the viscosity is high, the shear associated with even a huge wave is really not that big at that scale, so it's not going to harm it very much. And so those are the two main reasons. Is just the movement of the water and the variable levels that don't allow them to get established very well. And really, in most large lakes, unless there's a protected area, you can't get very large macrophyte populations. There are some exceptions to that. The Great Lakes have Cladophora, which is a attached green alga, and that is large enough that you can see it, and some might consider it a macrophyte, and that reaches nuisance levels. And so there are exceptions to that. And there are non-vascular plants and vascular plants. The bryophytes, the mosses and liverworts. The mosses can be particularly important in streams and lakes in Arctic areas or in very shaded areas. So there are some systems where they're really dominant producers. And sphagnum is a globally important bryophyte. It's important in carbon deposition in peat bogs. And the reason it does well is it's resistant to acid and it can deal with cold temperatures. So that is helpful. Oh, it's 10:20, so they're testing the sirens. If y'all can hear that, probably at your houses too. That means there's no emergency because it's completely clear out. So we can keep going. Some aquatic mosses can also be found deep in oligotrophic lakes. There's some that are found in Crater Lake quite deep, and because they can grow very slowly, and they tend to be resistant to grazers as well. So they seem to do well, where there's not much light and maybe not much nutrients, and they can just grow slowly. But it doesn't matter because they are not being eaten. Vascular plants dominate many wetlands, and many wetlands are classified based on the vegetation that they contain. So we already saw that when we talked about the wetland groups. We talked about mangrove swamps and grass in saltgrass marshes and things like that. Emergent forests, wetlands. All of these things are based on the vegetation that they contain. So the first plate here is of emergent plants, and there's a variety of different kinds. Some of them you're probably quite familiar with, the sedges and rushes. The bulrushes like the cattails are really common. Wild rice is one that's important for producing food in the upper Midwestern United States. And rice itself, this is not closely related. Rice itself is another emergent plant that has fed human populations for centuries. Wow, they're really going a long time on these sirens, aren't they? Okay. So then there's floating attached and floating unattached. So some plants like water lilies, the A in the upper part, are actually attached to the bottom and then float up to the top. But as I mentioned before, the largest of these water lilies that's found in the Amazon is actually big enough that a person can lie on it and float on it. So they have spectacular flowers, really common in ornamentals also in ponds that people use. The rest of these are floating macrophytes. Some are really common. The Azolla, the water fern, is really important. Has a cyanobacterium as an endosymbiont, and we'll talk about that later, but it is something that historically made rice culture possible for repeatedly without adding inorganic nutrients as they do now in Southeast Asia. And duckweed is, you can see, and D is the world's smallest flowering plant, and you can just see it, and it can really cover the surfaces of some calm ponds and areas. It can be really, really important there. The water hyacinth is an invasive species in subtropical areas that it can be so thick that it can literally dam a river and hold the flow back, and it can make it so boats just can't physically get through. It's not a problem if it freezes. So it can be invasive in Florida, for example, and parts of Texas, and parts of California where it just doesn't freeze in the winter. But this far north, it is not yet a problem. Now with global warming, you never know. In a century, maybe it'll be up here, but it may be the least of our problems if that happens. And then there's some submerged plants, those that are completely underneath the water. Some of these, like the Potamogeton we saw in Potawatomi State Lake number 2. And if we look around, we can see a number of these. This is a different species of Potamogeton, and you can see there's quite a bit of variation in that that genus. Both G and H are different species of Potamogeton. So C, G, and H are Potamogeton. In addition, there's some here that like water milfoil B. This is an invasive species in the United States and causes quite a bit of trouble and clogs up things. In general, in management, we'll talk about macrophyte management. They can be a nuisance if they're too thick that people can't swim, or fish lures get caught. But they're also part of a healthy system. Many ponds would, the fish need them as shelter. Small fish need them as shelter and places to breed. And so it's a balance between having the right amount and not. So this is also part of wetland restoration, which we'll discuss, is getting the native plants back in, and these would include both emergent and submerged macrophytes. In some cases, these are actually endangered species as well. Do most of the macrophytes reproduce by fragmentation? Yeah, many of them are capable of reproducing by fragmentation. They may be rooted, but they can break off and reform roots, and they definitely do, and certainly like the duckweed and those floating ones. Many of those floating ones just grow and divide and grow and divide like that, so they just fragment. Although they can also, some of them can reproduce sexually fairly frequently. Oftentimes, what will happen is they'll actually put their reproductive structures, they'll make them emergent, and then make their seeds and fertilize and make their seeds.